The man who called himself Jesse Callahan drifted into Dry Creek the way a tumbleweed did, pushed by a relentless wind and coated in the dust of a dozen forgotten trails. He was a specter of a man, lean to the point of being skeletal, with a haunted look in his pale blue eyes that spoke of things best left unsaid. His clothes were ragged threads clinging to a frame that had seen too much sun and not enough food. He walked with a slight limp, a phantom pain that echoed a real one from long ago. He owned nothing but the worn-out boots on his feet, a canteen that sloshed with the last of its lukewarm water, and a secret buried so deep it felt like a stone in his gut. He stopped at the saloon first, not for whiskey, but for information. The talk was of cattle prices, the lack of rain, and the widow Whitmore, a woman trying to hold on to her ranch with nothing but grit and a Colt Peacemaker strapped to her hip. The ranch was a few miles out of town, a lonely patch of land that the sun seemed determined to bake into oblivion. That's where Jesse headed. Clara Whitmore was standing on her porch when he approached, a rifle held loosely in the crook of her arm. She was not a beautiful woman in the delicate way of city folk, but she possessed a stark, unyielding strength that was its own kind of beauty. Her face was etched with the lines of worry and sun. Her hands were chapped and calloused, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They assessed Jesse in a single, sweeping glance, taking in the tattered clothes, the exhaustion, and the quiet desperation. "State your business," she said, her voice as dry and unadorned as the land around them. "Looking for work, ma'am," Jesse replied, his own voice raspy from disuse. "Anything that needs doing. Fencing, mucking out, whatever you've got. I don't need much. A roof and a meal is pay enough." Clara's gaze lingered on him. She had seen men like him before, drifters broken by the war, by loss, by the sheer, grinding hardship of the West. Most were trouble, carrying their demons in a whiskey bottle. But there was something different in this man's eyes. It wasn't meanness. It was a profound weariness, a sorrow that seemed to have settled into his very bones. She was a woman who knew sorrow well. "The last hand I hired ran off with 2 of my best chickens," she said, her tone sharp. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm too tired to run, ma'am," Jesse said. And it was the plain, unvarnished truth. Perhaps it was that honesty, or perhaps it was the flicker of a shared pain she saw in his face. But Clara lowered the rifle. "The bunkhouse is out back. The stable roof is leaking. The north fence is down. And the well pump needs a new washer. You can start there. You'll earn your keep. If you don't, you're gone by morning." She was a woman of few words and high standards, but beneath the stern exterior was a core of compassion she rarely showed. She was a widow, alone, in a world that had little mercy for solitary women. Hardness was a shield she couldn't afford to set down. She watched him walk toward the barn, his shoulders slumped, and felt a reluctant stir of pity. The world they inhabited was a testament to survival. The land itself was an adversary. The sun beat down relentlessly, cracking the earth into a web of fissures. The wind was a constant thief, stealing moisture from the soil and grit from the earth to hurl against any living thing. It howled through the nights and whispered threats during the day. In Dry Creek, a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the speed of his draw. Every man, and many women like Clara, wore a gun. It wasn't for show. It was a tool, as essential as a hammer or a shovel in a place where the law was often just the person who held the bigger weapon. Jesse Callahan, for all his worn-out appearance, was no stranger to hard work. He moved with a quiet, efficient economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of labor. The first day, he didn't just patch the stable roof, he stripped the rotten shingles, reinforced the main beam that was threatening to sag, and made it sounder than it had been in years. The second day, he rode the northern fence line, and by the third, the sagging wire was taut and the broken posts replaced. He worked from before the sun rose until long after it had set. asking for nothing but water and the simple meals Clara left for him on a tin plate by the bunkhouse door. One evening, a week into his stay, a small band of rustlers, emboldened by the belief that a lone widow was an easy target, tried to run off with a half-dozen of her cattle. Clara was woken by the nervous lowing of the herd. By the time she grabbed her rifle and ran outside, she saw a single, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the pasture. A shot rang out, not at the rustlers, but into the air. It was a warning. Sharp and clear in the night, the would-be thieves scattered back into the darkness. When Clara reached the fence, Jesse was calmly reloading his pistol. "Just encouraging them to find easier pastures, ma'am," he said, his face unreadable in the moonlight. That night, for the first time, Clara didn't leave his plate by the door. She gestured for him to sit on the edge of the porch, a good 10 feet away from her rocking chair. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the sigh of the wind. "You handle a gun well?" she finally said. "I've had cause to," he answered, and left it at that. Slowly, over the next few weeks, these nightly encounters on the porch became a ritual. They rarely spoke of personal matters, but they found a strange comfort in the shared silence. They talked of the land, of the stubbornness of cattle, of the signs of a coming storm. She saw the deep, crisscrossing scars on his hands and knew they told a story of more than just ranch work. He saw the permanent sadness in her eyes and understood it was a reflection of his own. The war was a ghost that haunted them both, an unspoken presence that hung in the air between them. They were two survivors of a shipwreck, washed ashore on the same desolate island, recognizing in each other the same haunted look of having seen the world end. One night, alone in the dim light of his bunkhouse, Jesse pulled a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle from the bottom of his bedroll. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside, tarnished and dull, was a brass insignia, the eagle and shield of the Union Army. He ran a thumb over its surface, the metal cold against his skin. It was a brand, a symbol of a life he had run from, a past he could never outrun. He was a liar, living under the roof of a woman whose entire world had been shattered by men who wore that same symbol. He quickly wrapped it back up and hid it away, the weight of his deceit pressing down on him. Weeks turned into a month, and the relentless heat finally broke. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a rain that was long overdue. It came not as a gentle shower, but as a deluge, a violent torrent that turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The wind tore at the small house, and the rain hammered against the roof like a drumbeat of war. Jesse was securing the horses when he heard a crash from the main house. He ran through the storm to find Clara on the floor, a feverish glint in her eyes, a shattered water pitcher beside her. She had been ill for a day, trying to fight it off with the same stubborn pride she fought everything else. But the fever had won. He carried her to her bed, his touch surprisingly gentle. She was light, her body burning with heat. For the next 2 days, as the storm raged outside, he became her caretaker. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, coaxed spoonfuls of broth between her chapped lips, and sat by her bed, listening to her fevered, nonsensical muttering. In her delirium, she called out a name, Samuel, over and over, her voice thick with anguish. In those long hours, watching over her, something shifted in Jesse. The harsh lines of her face softened in her sleep, revealing a vulnerability he had never seen. He saw not just the stern ranch owner, but the lonely woman beneath, a fragile tendency. Something he thought had died in him on a bloody field in Shiloh began to stir. It was a dangerous feeling, a sliver of hope in a heart that had long since declared itself barren. On the third morning, the storm had passed, and her fever broke. She awoke to find him asleep in a chair by her bed, his head slumped onto his chest. The rising sun cast a pale light into the room. Weakly, she sat up. "Jesse?" He woke with a start, his eyes clearing as he saw she was lucid. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. "Welcome back, ma'am." As he stood to fetch her some fresh water, his gaze fell upon the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. On it sat a single, silver-framed photograph. It was a portrait of a man in his late 20s, handsome and proud, with kind eyes and a confident smile. He was wearing the gray uniform of a Confederate officer. Jesse froze, the water bucket forgotten in his hand. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He could almost hear the thunder of cannons, smell the acrid scent of gunpowder. The officer in the photograph was Samuel, Clara's husband, and Jesse recognized the insignia on his collar. He recognized the man. He didn't remember picking up the bucket or leaving the room. He just found himself outside, leaning against the porch railing, the morning air feeling cold against his clammy skin. He had seen that face before, not smiling in a photograph, but pale and still in the mud of a battlefield far from here. Clara Whitmore's husband had been killed in a raid led by his own Union platoon. And in that moment, the fragile spark of hope that had ignited in his chest was extinguished, replaced by a hollow, crushing ache of guilt. He stared out at the damp earth. A man who had fled from his past only to find it waiting for him in the home of the one person who had shown him kindness. He slowly lowered his head, a silent admission of a sin he could never confess and a shame he could never wash away. Clara recovered slowly, her physical strength returning faster than the ironclad resolve that usually guarded her heart. The fever had burned away some of her defenses, leaving a raw vulnerability in its wake. She found herself watching Jesse as he worked, noting the steady, rhythmic way he moved, the quiet competence in his hands. He never spoke of the days he'd nursed her through the storm. He simply went back to his duties, mending what was broken, reinforcing what was weak. A fragile trust began to take root in the barren soil of her loneliness. He had seen her at her lowest, and he had not fled. He had stayed. One evening, as they sat on the porch in their now familiar ritual, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, she found herself speaking of him, of Samuel. "He built this house with his own hands," she began, her voice soft, distant. "Every log, every stone in that fireplace. He said a man's home was his kingdom, and this was ours. He wasn't a rancher by trade. He was a scholar, loved books more than cattle, but he loved this land, and he loved me. So he learned." Jesse remained perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his face a mask of quiet attention. Inside, a storm of his own was gathering. Every word she spoke was a hot coal pressed against his conscience. "When the war came," she continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon, "he said it was his duty, to protect his home, his way of life. I begged him not to go. He was so full of fire, so certain of the righteousness of their cause." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "He promised he'd be back by Christmas. They all did, didn't they?" Jesse swallowed hard, the dust in his throat suddenly thick as mud. He wanted to tell her to stop, to spare them both, but he was held captive by her grief. "He was killed near a place called Falling Creek," she said, the name of the skirmish a cold, hard stone in her mouth. "Not in a grand battle, an ambush, a Union patrol. They said in the letter they were on a supply raid. He wasn't even on the front line. He was just in the wrong place." The letter was so brief, so formal. "We regret to inform you," as if a few words on a piece of paper could cover the cost of a man's life. Jesse's blood ran cold. Falling Creek. He had been there. He had been part of that patrol. He could see it now, the frantic confusion, the crack of rifles from the trees, the smell of blood and damp earth. He remembered an officer falling, a man with a handsome, shocked face, Samuel. He clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, the nails digging into his palms. He hadn't fired the shot. He hadn't given the order. That had been a lieutenant, a cruel man named Finch who saw sport in the killing. But he had been there. He had worn the blue uniform, carried the rifle, and marched away while Samuel Whitmore lay dying in the mud. He was complicit. The guilt was a physical thing, a serpent coiling in his stomach, its venom seeping into his soul. He offered her the only thing he could, a silent, shared sorrow, a lie that felt more like a betrayal than any words he could have spoken. He was a ghost at the feast of her grief. A few days later, Clara had to ride into Dry Creek for supplies. As she waited for Mr. Abernathy to weigh out a sack of flour at the general store, she became aware of the hushed whispers of two women in the aisle behind her. The name Callahan snagged her attention. "Says he was with the 5th Infantry, the one that saw all that action in Tennessee," one woman whispered. "That's not what I heard," the other replied, her voice laced with righteous gossip. "Martha's boy, who served with the cavalry, said the name sounds familiar. Said there was a Callahan who was brought up on charges. Desertion. They called it. Vanished right before a big push." Clara's back stiffened. She turned, her expression uninviting. The women fell silent, suddenly very interested in a display of canned peaches. Mr. Abernathy, a kind man with sad eyes, cleared his throat and avoided her gaze. The rumor was out, slithering through the town like a snake in the grass. Asterisk, deserter, asterisk. The word was a stain, a brand of cowardice and dishonor. She paid for her supplies, her mind racing. It was just gossip, she told herself, the idle chatter of bored women. But the seed of doubt had been planted. It was one more secret in a man who seemed to be made of them. That evening, instead of leaving Jessie's plate on the porch, she opened the door to her home. "Come inside, Jessie," she said, her voice even. "It's time you had a proper meal at a table." It was a boundary being crossed, a wall being dismantled, and they both knew it. The interior of the house was simple, clean, and filled with the lingering presence of the man who had built it. The portrait on the mantelpiece seemed to watch them, its painted eyes a silent judgment. Jessie felt like an intruder, a blasphemer in a holy place. He sat stiffly at the small wooden table, his large, calloused hands looking out of place against the polished surface. They ate in a thick, charged silence. The air hummed with everything they weren't saying. Clara watched him, studying the way he ate, the weariness in his shoulders, the deep lines around his eyes. She saw the ghost of the deserter the women whispered about, but she also saw the man who had repaired her fence, protected her cattle, and cooled her brow when she was burning with fever. The two images warred in her mind. Finally, she put her fork down. Their eyes met across the table. In that single, sustained gaze, 1,000 unsaid things were exchanged. He saw her doubt, her loneliness, her desperate need to trust someone. She saw his pain, a sorrow so profound it seemed to have no bottom, and a flicker of something else, a desperate, hunted look, the look of a man trapped by his own past. It was a moment of stark, terrifying honesty, a silent confession that they were both broken, both lost, and both achingly alone. Later that night, long after Jessie had retreated to his bunkhouse, Clara sat in a rocking chair, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The dinner had unsettled her, breaking the careful peace she had constructed around her heart. The loneliness, always a dull ache beneath the surface, became a sharp, unbearable agony. She was a widow on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the threats of her future. The dam of her composure finally broke. A single sob escaped her lips, then another, until she was weeping uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her desolation. In his bunkhouse, Jessie heard her. The sound was faint at first, almost lost to the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a soul breaking. He lay on his cot, his body rigid, his conscience at war with itself. He had no right to comfort her. His very presence in her life was a lie. To touch her would be the ultimate betrayal. He was the cause of her widowhood, a living symbol of the force that had destroyed her world. He should stay put. He should leave at first light and never return. But the sound of her crying tore through his defenses. It was the sound of his own grief, his own loneliness, mirrored back at him. He could not bear it. Hesitantly, he rose from the cot. He walked out into the cool night and stood before her door, his hand raised to knock, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood there for a full minute, a man balanced on the knife's edge of his past and his future. Then, slowly, he pushed the door open. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide and startled in the dim lamplight. He said nothing. He walked to her, knelt before her rocking chair, and gently took her hands in his. The first touch was electric. It was a current of shared pain, of profound human need. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply held her hands, his thumb stroking the back of hers, a silent anchor in her storm of grief. She leaned forward, her head falling against his chest, and her sobs quieted into a mournful keening. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she were the most fragile thing in the world. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of sanctuary. For the first time in years, they were not alone in their sorrow. They were two survivors, clinging to each other in the wreckage. That night, their broken pieces fit together, not to become whole, but to feel less shattered. In the quiet darkness of the small house, amidst the ghosts of war and loss, they found a fleeting, desperate solace in each other's arms. Clara awoke just before dawn. The first gray light was filtering through the window, painting the room in soft, muted tones. She was in her own bed, the warmth of Jesse's body a solid presence beside her, a feeling of profound peace, something she hadn't felt since before the war, settled over her. But then, she turned her head. Jesse was no longer beside her. He was standing by the window, his back to her, completely naked. The pale morning light sculpted the muscles and scars of his back, each mark a testament to a brutal history. He was staring out at the harsh, unforgiving landscape of her ranch as if it were an enemy he had to face. There was no softness in his posture, no sign of the tender man who had held her through the night. He was a statue of tension and secrets, his silhouette framed against the bleakness of the world outside. And, in that moment, a cold certainty washed over Clara, chilling her to the bone despite the warmth of the blankets. She knew, with an instinct that went deeper than words, that the man who had shared her bed, the man who was beginning to capture her heart, was still a stranger. He carried a secret far darker and heavier than a simple rumor of desertion. She had let him into her home and into her arms, but a vital part of him remained outside, standing guard in the desolate dawn. The nights after their encounter became a crucible for Jesse. Sleep offered no escape, but a descent into a recurring hell. He was back in the war, the mud of Tennessee sucking at his boots. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of black powder, a sulphurous fog that choked the lungs and stung the eyes. He heard the screams of men and horses, a symphony of agony that the years had failed to silence. And in the heart of the chaos, he always saw him, Samuel Whitmore. The dream memory was always the same, a chaotic skirmish in a wooded ravine, the crackle of rifle fire from unseen places, Lieutenant Finch, a man with cold, dead eyes, barking orders. Then, through the smoke, a figure in a gray officer's coat, rallying his men. Samuel. He was brave. Jesse would give him that. He stood his ground when others scattered. Then came the volley from Jesse's platoon. The dream would slow down, every detail magnified. Jesse saw the impact of the lead ball, the small, dark blossom on the gray wool of Samuel's uniform. He saw the look of profound surprise on the handsome face, the confident smile vanishing, replaced by a confused O of the mouth. He saw Samuel's knees buckle, his body slumping into the wet, bloody leaves. In the dream, Jesse never fired his rifle, but he was there, a silent, blue-coated witness to the extinguishing of the life that was the center of Clara's world. He would wake up in his bunkhouse, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the ghost of Samuel's last breath caught in his own throat. He started throwing himself into his work with a renewed, desperate frenzy, as if physical exhaustion could chase the phantoms from his mind. But every time he looked at Clara, every time she offered him a small, hesitant smile, he saw Samuel's face reflected in her eyes. The trust she was giving him felt like a brand on his soul. Then, one sun-bleached afternoon, the past rode into Dry Creek. It arrived not as a ghost, but in the flesh, accompanied by a detail of 4 Union cavalrymen whose blue uniforms looked alien and menacing against the dusty browns of the town. They rode with a purpose that made shopkeepers pause and saloon patrons step into the street to watch. At their head was a woman. She sat on her horse with an erect, military posture, her face shielded from the sun by the brim of a smart, dark hat. She was dressed in a tailored riding habit of fine material, and pinned to the jacket was a small, gleaming medal. She was a woman who commanded attention. As she dismounted in front of the saloon, Jesse, who had been loading sacks of feed onto the wagon, froze. The blood drained from his face. He knew that posture, that confident tilt of the head. It was Emmeline. She was no longer the hopeful girl he had left behind in a small Ohio town 5 years ago, with a broken promise and a hastily written note. War had forged her into something new, something hard and polished as steel. Her eyes, which he remembered as being soft and forgiving, now held a sharp, appraising glint. They swept across the town and settled on him. There was a flicker of recognition, but no warmth. She spoke a few words to her men, who dismounted and stood at ease, their presence an implicit declaration of federal authority. Then she walked directly toward him, her boots making crisp sounds in the thick dust. "Jesse Callahan," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was as he remembered, yet stripped of its former melody, now clipped and official, or whatever name you're using these days. "I need a word with you." He could only nod, his throat too tight for speech. He was aware of Clara stepping out of the general store, a bag of supplies in her hand, her gaze falling on the scene. He saw the confusion, then the dawning suspicion on her face as she took in the soldiers, the authoritative woman, and his own stricken expression. Emmeline led him to the alley between the saloon and the blacksmith's shop, a place of shadows and discarded things. "You've come down in the world," she observed, her eyes raking over his worn clothes. "I always wondered where you'd run to. I never pictured this." "What do you want, Emmeline?" he managed to ask, his voice a rough whisper. "My name is Captain Vance now," she corrected him coolly. "Logistics and acquisitions, United States Army. It turns out that when a man abandons you, you find other ways to make your mark on the world. The Army values efficiency. It doesn't ask for promises it has no intention of keeping." The sting of her words was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the dread coiling in his gut. "What acquisitions?" She got straight to the point. "There's a ranch a few miles from here, sits on a rise, good water source, commands a clear view of the pass. Strategically valuable, the Army is expanding its network of outposts to protect the new railway lines and pacify the territory. We need that land." Jesse felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "The Whitmore Ranch." "So you do know it," she said, a small, mirthless smile touching her lips. "I was told a drifter was working there. I should have known it would be you. You always did have a knack for finding your way into complicated situations." A hot, helpless anger rose in him. You can't just take her home." "Oh, we can," Emmeline said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's a matter of national security, progress. The owner is the widow of a Confederate officer. Politically, it's a simple matter. She'll be compensated. Of course, fair market value." "Fair?" he choked out. "Her husband built that place. He died for it. She's poured her own blood and sweat into that dirt. There's no price you can put on that." "The war is over. Jesse, sentiment doesn't build nations." She reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a thick document tied with a ribbon. It bore the official seal of the territorial government. This is an executive order, signed by the governor. The land has been appropriated under the Federal Expansion Act. It's all legal. It's all done. I'm here to oversee the transfer." He stared at the document, at the confident, looping signature. He was trapped. The machinery of power, the very institution he had fled, had found him and was now poised to crush the one fragile thing he had hoped to build. He was caught between two women who represented the two halves of his damned soul. Emmeline was his past, a monument to his failure, his cowardice, his betrayal. She was the life he had destroyed through his inability to face his own demons. Clara was his present, and his desperate, undeserved hope for a future. She was the chance to atone, to be a better man than the one who had run away. And now, his past had arrived to obliterate his future. From across the street, Clara watched them. She couldn't hear their words, but she could read the language of their bodies. She saw the way Jesse stood, cornered and defensive. She saw the way the woman, this Captain Vance, held the papers, a symbol of irrefutable power. The interaction was too intense, too familiar for a chance encounter between a captain and a ranch hand. A cold knot of jealousy and suspicion tightened in her stomach. Who was this woman? And what hold did she have over the man who had shared Clara's bed? That night, the porch ritual was broken. Jesse was a storm of agitation, pacing the length of the barn, his mind a whirlwind of impossible choices. He had to warn Clara. He had to tell her everything. The lie had become a cancer, and it was about to consume them both. He walked to the house 3 times, his hand raised to knock, and 3 times his courage failed him. How could he begin? "Clara, the woman you saw me with today is my wife, the one I deserted. And she's come here with the army to take your land. By the way, I was there when your husband was killed. I was one of them." The words were poison. They would not just break her trust, they would shatter her. The image of her face, twisted in hatred and betrayal, was more than he could bear. He was a coward. He had been a coward when he ran from the war, a coward when he ran from Emmeline. And he was a coward now. His indecision was his undoing. Clara, unable to sleep, was tormented by the image of Jesse and the mysterious captain. The whispers of deserter now seemed less like gossip and more like a missing piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. Needing air, she stepped quietly onto the porch. That's when she saw them. 2 figures stood in the deep shadows near the corral, their voices low and urgent. It was Jesse and Captain Vance. Emmeline must have ridden out from town. Drawn by an instinct she couldn't fight, Clara slipped around the side of the house, keeping to the darkness, until she was close enough to hear. "No other way! Jesse!" Emmeline was saying, her voice sharp with impatience. "The order is to have the land secured by the end of the week. My career depends on this. You owe me." "I owe you?" Jesse's voice was ragged with disbelief. "I owe that woman in there everything. You don't know what she's been through." "I can imagine," Emmeline shot back. "Her husband was killed at Falling Creek, wasn't he? A pity. But war is full of pity. You of all people should know that." There was a pause, and then she delivered the final, devastating blow. "How do you think she'll feel when she finds out the truth? That the man she's taken into her home, into her bed, is a bluebelly? A Union man who stood by and watched her husband die? You think she'll thank you for your silence then?" In the darkness, Clara forgot to breathe. The world tilted, the ground falling away beneath her. Asterisk bluebelly, Union man, stood by and watched her husband die. The words were not just bullets. They were cannonballs, tearing through the fragile structure of her life, leveling everything she had started to rebuild. The man she had trusted, the man whose touch had reawakened her heart, was one of them. He was her enemy. He was a lie, from his ragged clothes to his haunted eyes. And he was here, on her land, as the vanguard of its destruction. The grief, the betrayal, the rage, it all coalesced into a single, blinding point of agony in her chest. The night, which had felt so empty and lonely moments before, was now suffocatingly full of his deceit. For a long moment after Emmeline's words sliced through the darkness, Clara remained frozen in the shadows, the world a discordant symphony of her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. The cold reality of the betrayal was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs, threatening to crush her. Then, the shock receded, and in its place, a volcanic rage erupted, searing away the grief and leaving behind a white-hot, purifying fury. She stepped out from the side of the house, her movement so sudden that both Jessie and Emmeline started. She ignored Emmeline completely, her eyes blazing with a hatred so intense it was terrifying, fixed solely on Jessie. She saw him not as the quiet, hard-working man who had shared her porch and her bed, but as an infestation, a parasite that had burrowed its way into the heart of her life, only to poison it from within. "Get out," she said, her voice a low, trembling snarl that was more menacing than any shout. Jessie's face, already pale in the moonlight, turned ashen. He took a step toward her, his hands raised in a useless, placating gesture. "Clara, please, let me explain." "Explain?" She laughed, a sound as sharp and broken as shattering glass. "Explain what? Explain how a blue-belly liar ends up on my land. Explain how the man who watched my husband die has the gall to eat at my table." Each question was a lash, and he flinched as if physically struck. "You stood there, in my house, and you looked at his picture. You looked at it and you said, **nothing*." "I wanted to tell you," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Every day. I wanted to—" "You wanted to keep your secret," she spat, advancing on him. "You wanted to play the part of the poor drifter while your army planned to steal everything I have left. Was this part of the plan? Were you sent here to scout, to see how easily the Confederate widow would fall?" "No, God, no, Clara, it was never like that," he insisted, his own anguish pouring out. But his words were meaningless now, drowned out by the thunder of his deceit. Emmeline watched the scene with a detached, clinical interest, her arms crossed over her chest. This was a private agony, and she had no part in it beyond being the catalyst. "Every kind word I spoke to you, every meal I shared, it was all a lie, wasn't it?" Clara's voice broke, tears of rage finally spilling down her cheeks, hot and bitter. "You let me touch you. You held me. You made me feel—" She couldn't finish, choking on the memory of their intimacy, which now felt like the most profound violation of all. "Get out of my house. Get off my land. Take your uniform and your medals and your lies and get out of my sight before I use the rifle Samuel left me to put a hole through your black heart." The threat hung in the air, deadly and absolute. Jessie looked at her, his own eyes swimming with a pain that mirrored her own. He saw the abyss he had created between them, a chasm of betrayal that could never be crossed. He opened his mouth to speak again, but then he closed it. There was nothing left to say. Her judgment was righteous, and her sentence was just. Without another word, he turned. He didn't look back at Emmeline. He didn't look at the bunkhouse that had been his sanctuary. He simply walked past the corral, past the fence line he had mended with his own hands, and dissolved into the oppressive darkness of the prairie. He was a ghost once more, leaving behind the only place that had ever felt like a home. Clara stood trembling in the yard, watching him go until he was completely swallowed by the night. The rage that had sustained her began to ebb, leaving her hollow and shaking. She turned to find Emmeline still watching her, her expression unreadable. "Sheath your claws, Mrs. Whitmore," Emmeline said, her tone crisp. "My business with him is concluded. My business with you begins tomorrow." She mounted her horse with fluid grace and rode away, her soldiers falling in line behind her, their departure as orderly and ominous as their arrival. The next morning, Emmeline returned as promised, alone this time. She rode up to the porch where Clara sat, shotgun across her lap, her eyes red-rimmed but her jaw set like granite. Emmeline dismounted and, without waiting for an invitation, produced the official military order. This is the writ of appropriation for this property, designated for federal use, she stated, holding it out. You will be compensated at a rate of $2 per acre. You have 48 hours to vacate. You'll find a signature line at the bottom. Clara didn't even glance at the paper. Her eyes were locked on Emmeline's. I'm not signing anything. This is my land. You're not taking it. A flicker of annoyance crossed Emmeline's face. Mrs. Whitmore, I advise you not to be foolish. This is not a request. It is a lawful order from the United States government. Your signature is a formality, a courtesy to make the transfer seem amicable, with or without it. This ranch will belong to the Army. Then you'll have to take it from my dead body, Clara said, her voice flat and cold. Emmeline sighed, a sound of weary condescension. You people and your lost causes. The war is over. Your side lost. This attachment to dirt and pride is what cost you everything in the first place. Resist, and you won't be compensated. Resist forcefully, and you will be arrested for impeding a federal directive. You will be removed. You will get nothing, and you will lose everything. Is this patch of dust really worth that? It's not dust, Clara replied, her knuckles white on the stock of her gun. It's my home. Now get off my porch. For a long moment, the two women stared each other down, a silent battle of wills under the harsh morning sun. Finally, Emmeline retrieved the document. 48 hours, she said, her voice clipped. The Army is not known for its patience. As Emmeline rode away, the weight of her threat settled on Clara. She was alone, facing the full might of the U.S. government, desperate. She saddled her horse and rode into Dry Creek. Her first stop was the small, clapboard church. She found Reverend Michael tending his meager garden. He was a good man, but a timid one. His sermons more focused on meekness and forgiveness than fire and brimstone. He listened to her story with a deeply troubled expression, his hands wringing a dirt-stained rag. This is a terrible injustice, Clara. A true test of faith, he murmured, his eyes darting around nervously as if Army spies were hiding in his tomato plants. I need your help, Reverend, she pleaded. You're a respected man. If you spoke out, if you rallied the town. The Reverend paled. My dear woman, speak out against the Army? This is a federal matter. What could I possibly do? They have soldiers, laws. We must simply pray for guidance. Pray that their hearts are softened. Clara left the church with a heart full of scorn. Prayers would not stop soldiers. Her next stop was the office of Mr. Gable, the town's only lawyer. A portly man with a penchant for quoting regulations that profited him. He listened to her story while polishing his spectacles, his expression shifting from concerned to professionally detached. An executive order, you say, signed by the governor, he puffed, looking at her over the rim of his glasses. Well, that's quite ironclad. Mrs. Whitmore, appropriation under the Expansion Act is, well, it's legal. Unfortunate, but legal. My advice would be to take the compensation. $2 an acre is not an ungenerous offer in the current climate. You won't fight for me? She asked, her voice hollow. Fight whom? The United States Army? My dear lady, I am a lawyer, not a fool. My hands are tied. Now, about my fee for this consultation. Clara walked out of his office, the final door of hope slamming shut behind her. Her community, the people she had known for years, had turned their backs. They were afraid. They had chosen their own safety over her survival. She was utterly, completely alone. That night, she didn't light the lamps. She sat in the dark, the silence of the house a living, breathing thing, magnifying her despair. She found the bottle of whiskey Samuel had kept for special occasions, still half full. She hadn't touched it since the day she'd received the letter about his death. Now, she poured a generous measure into a glass, her hand shaking. The first sip was fire, burning a trail down her throat, but it did nothing to numb the gaping wound in her soul. She drank more. the raw spirit searing away her tears, leaving a dry, desolate ache. She took the bottle and the glass out to the porch and sat in a rocking chair, a solitary figure adrift in an ocean of darkness. The whiskey didn't bring oblivion, only a blurry, maudlin sorrow. She was a fool to have let a man in, a fool to have believed in her own strength, a fool to think this patch of earth could ever truly be hers. The world belonged to men like Lieutenant Finch and lawyers like Mr. Gable and women like Captain Vance. It belonged to the powerful and the ruthless. There was no room left for her. From a ridge overlooking the ranch, hidden in a thicket of mesquite, Jesse watched her. He had not left. He couldn't. He had been circling the property like a restless spirit, drawn by a gravitational pull of guilt and a desperate, lingering protectiveness. He saw the house remain dark, and then he saw her small figure emerge onto the porch. He watched her lift the glass to her lips again and again, saw the way her body slumped in the chair, saw the faint, erratic trembling that shook her frame. The sight of her, so broken and alone, was a knife twisting in his gut. This was his work. He had done this to her. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to take the bottle from her hand, to hold her and absorb her pain. But he knew his presence would only be salt in her wounds. He was the ghost at this feast of sorrow, and he had no right to comfort her. He could not leave her with nothing, though. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth. It was a simple cotton handkerchief she had given him weeks ago to bind a cut on his hand. After it was clean, he'd seen she had embroidered a small C in the corner with blue thread. It was a small, almost invisible thing, but it was the kindest gesture he'd been shown in years. Silently, moving like a shadow, he crept down from the ridge. He skirted the edge of the yard, staying deep in the darkness, his heart pounding with the fear of being seen. He reached the steps of the porch, just a few feet from where she sat, lost in her drunken misery. She didn't stir. With infinite care, he placed the folded handkerchief on the top step, the small blue C facing up. It was a pathetic offering, a coward's apology, a ghost's touch. Then, as quietly as he had come, he retreated back into the blackness of the night, leaving her alone with her bottle and the single, silent testament to the man who had destroyed her. The morning of the third day dawned not with the sharp, clear light of the prairie, but under a thick, clinging shroud of fog. It was an anomaly, a damp, gray blanket that muted the landscape, distorted distances, and muffled sound. It clung to the eaves of the house and coiled around the fence posts like a ghostly serpent. Inside, Clara was awake. She had not slept. The discovery of the handkerchief on her porch step had been a strange and unsettling coda to her night of despair. It was a tangible piece of him, left in the dark, a gesture she could not comprehend. It wasn't an apology, not a plea. It was simply a presence, a sign that even in her deepest misery, she had not been entirely alone. The small, embroidered C was a testament to a kindness that now felt like a cruel joke. Yet the gesture itself was undeniably gentle. The confusion had sobered her, leaving behind a hard, brittle resolve. She was standing by the window, Samuel's heavy Winchester rifle in her hands. When she first heard them, it wasn't a loud noise, but a collection of subtle sounds, amplified by the fog, the soft thud of dozens of hooves on the damp earth, the faint jingle of a bridle, the low murmur of a command. She watched as they materialized from the mist, not as men, but as dark, menacing silhouettes. Emmeline was at their head, flanked by a full platoon of cavalry this time, their blue uniforms a stark, unnatural color against the gray world. They didn't ride in with a clatter. They moved with a chilling, disciplined purpose, fanning out to form a perfect, inescapable perimeter around the ranch house. It was not an eviction. It was an occupation. Clara didn't flinch. She opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle held across her chest. The fog swirled around her ankles. She looked small and solitary against the backdrop of her home, but her stance was as unyielding as the oldest oak on the property. Emmeline halted her horse a dozen yards from the steps. "Your time is up, Mrs. Whitmore," she called out, her voice cutting through the damp air. "I gave you a chance to do this with dignity." "There's no dignity in letting a thief into your house," Clara called back, her voice clear and steady. "This is as far as you go." "I have 20 armed men," Emmeline stated, gesturing to the soldiers who now sat silently on their mounts, a ring of steel and federal power. "You have a hunting rifle. This is not a negotiation." "It was never a negotiation," Clara replied. "It was a threat, and I don't answer to threats." The soldiers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from the lone woman on the porch to their captain. This was not the simple removal of a recalcitrant widow they had been led to expect. Just as Emmeline was about to give an order, a movement at the edge of the tree line drew every eye. A figure stumbled out of the fog. It was Jesse. He looked like a man who had been through his own private war in the last 2 days. His clothes were torn, his face was gaunt and stubbled with beard, and his eyes were hollowed out with sleeplessness and anguish. He walked not toward Clara, but directly into the open space between the porch and the soldiers, placing himself in the heart of the standoff. "Emmeline, don't do this," he said, his voice a raw plea. "For God's sake, there has to be another way. The railroad can go south of the pass. This is wrong." Emmeline's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. This public display of insubordination, this emotional appeal in front of her men, was an intolerable challenge to her authority. "Callahan," she snapped, her voice sharp as a whip crack, "you will remove yourself. This is a military action. You are a civilian. You have no standing here." "I have a standing in this," he shot back, his desperation making him bold. "This is my fault. Punish me. But leave her and her home out of it." Emmeline's patience, already worn thin, finally broke in a single, fluid motion. She drew the Colt revolver from the holster at her hip and aimed it, not at Clara, but squarely at Jesse's chest. The click of the hammer being cocked was unnaturally loud in the misty silence. "You are mistaken, sir," she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hiss. "You are not a civilian. You are a deserter. Your life is already forfeit to the United States Army. Your standing is as a traitor, and the penalty for that is death. Now you have a choice. You will assist my men in removing that woman from her property, and I may be inclined to forget I ever saw you, or you will continue to obstruct a federal order, and I will have you court-martialed and shot on this very spot. Choose. Now." The ultimatum hung in the air, absolute and deadly. Jesse looked at the gun pointed at his heart, then at Emmeline's implacable face. He saw no mercy there, only the cold logic of the institution she now served. Then, he turned his back on her. He turned his back on the platoon of soldiers, on the revolver, on the threat of his own imminent death. And he faced Clara. Slowly, deliberately, he walked the last few feet to the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a universe of shame and regret. And then he did something that stunned every person watching. He fell to his knees in the damp dirt before her. He lowered his head, and his shoulders began to shake with great, wrenching sobs. The sound of his weeping was the only sound in the world. When he finally looked up, his face was a ruin, streaked with tears and dirt. "Clara," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed agony. "She's right. I'm nothing. A liar. A coward. I deserve whatever happens to me. But you deserve to keep your home. You deserve peace." He took a ragged breath, his gaze locked on hers, begging for a final, terrible kind of absolution. "If you hate me, then let this be my end. Let them shoot me right here, on your land. I don't care. My life is worth nothing. But please, don't let them win. Don't let what I've done cost you everything. If you hate me, Clara, just let me die. but don't let them take your land." Clara stood frozen on the porch, the heavy rifle in her hand suddenly feeling as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. The world had shrunk to the space between her and the broken man kneeling at her feet. She looked down at him, this man who was her enemy, the symbol of her deepest loss, a liar who had trampled on her trust. But she also saw the man who had nursed her through a fever, who had protected her cattle, whose touch had made her feel alive again. She saw the raw, undeniable sincerity of his sacrifice. He was offering her his life, not as a trick, not as a manipulation, but as the only payment he had left to give. Her finger was on the trigger. Part of her, the wounded, vengeful part, screamed to pull it. Another part, the part that had wept into his shoulder, screamed at the horror of it. She was caught in an impossible crossfire of love and hate, betrayal and sacrifice. Her vision blurred. Her hands trembled. "This farce is over!" Emmeline's voice shattered the spell. Her face was a mask of cold impatience. This emotional spectacle was a dangerous liability. "Sergeant, place them both under arrest." 2 soldiers dismounted, their rifles held ready, and started moving toward the porch. Before they could take a single step toward Clara, Jesse reacted with the speed of a cornered animal. He surged to his feet, not to fight, but to protect. He lunged up the steps and shoved Clara, not with anger, but with a desperate, forceful urgency, pushing her back toward the open doorway of the house. "Get inside," he roared, his voice raw with command. "Bar the door! Don't come out!" He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. As she stumbled back into the shadows of the house, he turned to face the advancing soldiers, the entirety of the United States Army. He stood on the top step of her porch, a defiant, solitary guardian. And then, slowly, he raised his empty hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. The army did not take Jesse to the town jail. That was a place for common drunks and thieves, a place under the purview of a local sheriff who could be swayed by public opinion. Instead, they took him to their own jurisdiction, the temporary military station they had erected on a flat, barren piece of land just east of town. It wasn't a fort, just a collection of canvas tents arranged in stark, geometric lines, all centered around a hastily built stockade made of raw, sharpened timber. It was a place that smelled of sweat, horses, and unquestioned authority. This was where they held the disturbers, a catch-all term for anyone, settlers, natives, or drifters, who dared to interfere with the Army's vision of progress. Clara arrived the same afternoon, her face a pale, determined mask. The fog had burned off, replaced by a glaring sun that seemed to mock the cold dread in her heart. She was met at the entrance to the encampment by a sergeant with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by a lone woman's fury. "I'm here to see Jesse Callahan," she said, her voice devoid of any plea. It was a demand. The sergeant consulted a clipboard. "No one by that name is on the visitors list." "I'm not a visitor. He works for me. You have no right to hold him." "Ma'am," the sergeant said with practiced patience, "your hired hand is being held on charges of desertion and obstruction of a federal directive. His rights are a matter for a military tribunal. You have no standing here. Please return to your property." "He is not a deserter," she lied, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "There's been a mistake." "That will be for a court-martial to decide. Now, I have my orders." He was a wall of blue wool and regulations, and she knew with a sickening certainty that she could not pass. She stood there for a long moment, her helplessness a physical sickness, before turning her horse around, the sergeant's impassive gaze following her until she was gone. Defeated but not broken, she changed her tactics. If the army would not listen to her, perhaps they would listen to the law, or at least the weight of a community. She went back to Dry Creek, not to the timid reverend or the useless lawyer, but to the town's true seat of power, its matriarchs. She went to Mrs. Abernathy at the general store, to the blacksmith's wife, and to the stern-faced women who ran the church sewing circle. She found them gathered on the Abernathy's porch, their conversation stopping the moment she approached. The whispers about Jesse the deserter had now been replaced by the far more frightening reality of armed soldiers occupying their town's periphery. Clara's fight was no longer just her own. It was a precedent. If the army could seize her land with a piece of paper and a show of force, whose land was next? "They have him," Clara said, wasting no time on pleasantries. "They mean to try him, and God only knows what that means. And they still mean to take my ranch." Mrs. Abernathy, a stout woman with kind but shrewd eyes, nodded slowly. "We saw them ride out. Clara, it's a disgrace." "I need your help," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "One person. They can ignore, but they cannot ignore the whole town. We need to write a petition, a letter to the territorial governor himself. We must tell him that the army is overstepping its authority, that they are seizing private property without due process, that they are holding a man without trial." A spark of defiance lit up in the old woman's eyes. Fear of the army was one thing, but the sanctity of a person's home was another. It was a principle on which the West was built. By the end of the hour, they had gathered a half-dozen of the town's most respected elders. They sat around the Abernathy's dining table with paper and ink, painstakingly drafting a letter. They wrote, not of sentiment, but of law and rights, of the promises of the government that they now saw being broken by its own soldiers. It was a small act of rebellion, a fragile protest launched into the vast, indifferent bureaucracy, but it was all they had. Meanwhile, in the suffocating heat of the stockade, Jesse was surrendering to his own despair. He was in a small, cramped cell with 3 other men, but he was utterly alone. He refused the plates of hardtack and salted meat that were shoved through the bars. He ignored the water canteen. When the other prisoners tried to talk to him, he stared at the wall, his eyes vacant and unseeing. He had accepted his fate. He had offered his life on Clara's porch, and though she hadn't taken it, he felt as if his sentence had already been passed. His life had been a series of failures: a failed soldier, a failed husband, a failed protector. The guilt over Samuel, which had been a constant, dull ache, was now an all-consuming fire. In his mind, this was his penance. He would simply cease to be a final, silent apology to a world he had only ever seemed to harm. On the second day of his imprisonment, the weather turned. The sky, which had been a relentless, pale blue, took on a sickly yellow hue. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric tension. The horses in the army camp grew restless, pulling at their tethers. A low moan began on the horizon, a sound that steadily grew into a freight train roar, a sandstorm. It hit the camp with the force of a physical blow. A moving wall of dirt and grit, thousands of feet high, descended upon them, swallowing the sun and plunging the world into a howling, reddish-brown twilight. The wind tore at the tents, ripping canvas from its moorings. Visibility dropped to 0. It was chaos, a force of nature that made a mockery of military discipline. Emmeline was in the command tent, trying to secure maps and documents, when a massive gust of wind caught the main pole. With a sound of splintering wood, the entire structure collapsed. In the screaming, blinding maelstrom, she was thrown to the ground, her leg pinned beneath the heavy, fallen beam, the canvas wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Clara had seen the storm coming from her porch. She had secured the animals in the barn and battened down the house, her heart pounding in time with the rising wind. Her first thought was for the town. Her second, a thought she tried and failed to suppress, was for him, for Jesse, exposed and trapped in that flimsy stockade. But then she thought of the camp itself, a vulnerable island in the face of the storm's fury. When the heart of the storm passed, leaving a world coated in a thick layer of sand and a sky still dark with dust, a desperate instinct drove her. She saddled her horse and rode toward the army camp. It was a scene of devastation. Tents were shredded, wagons were overturned, and soldiers were struggling to bring order to the chaos. She saw them trying to round up terrified horses and check on the prisoners in the stockade, which had miraculously held. Then she saw the collapsed command tent. 2 soldiers were trying to pull away the heavy canvas, but they were struggling. She heard a faint cry for help from within. Something in the sound, its note of genuine fear, stripped of all authority, spurred her forward. Dismounting, she ran to help the soldiers. "What happened?" "It's the captain. Ma'am, she's trapped under the main pole." Together, the 3 of them heaved at the heavy, splintered beam. Clara was fueled by a strange, cold adrenaline. This was her enemy, the architect of her ruin, the woman who held Jesse's life in her hands. She should have felt a grim satisfaction. Instead, she felt nothing but the urgent, primal need to free a trapped human being. With a final, coordinated effort, they lifted the pole just enough for Emmeline to drag her leg free. She was covered in dust, her uniform torn, her face pale with shock and pain. Her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. As she looked up from the ground, her eyes met Clara's. In that moment, she was not Captain Vance of the UN Army. She was just Emmeline, a frightened, injured woman, staring in disbelief at the face of her rescuer. Clara, without a word, helped the soldiers carry her to the relative shelter of the supply wagon. She tore a strip from her own petticoat and, with a grim efficiency that surprised even herself, began to fashion a crude splint for Emmeline's ankle. That evening, as a fragile peace settled over the battered landscape, Emmeline sent for Clara. They met in the back room of Abernathy's general store, which had been converted into a temporary infirmary. Emmeline was sitting on a cot, her leg propped up, her face tight with pain and a new, unfamiliar emotion. Humility. "You saved my life," Emmeline said, the words sounding foreign on her tongue. "I would have done it for a dog," Clara replied, her voice flat. She would grant her enemy medical aid, but not the comfort of forgiveness. A long silence stretched between them. Emmeline looked down at her hands, the storm, the collapse, the unexpected act of grace from her adversary. It had shaken something loose inside her, cracking the rigid shell of her military resolve. The petition from the town arrived at the territorial capital this afternoon by telegraph, Emmeline said quietly. Combined with this storm, the loss of equipment, this entire operation has become a political and logistical nightmare. My superiors are displeased. She looked up, her eyes meeting Clara's with a direct, weary gaze. "I am prepared to offer you a proposition. Mrs. Whitmore, I will sign an order releasing Jesse Callahan. I will list his desertion charge as a clerical error, lost in the confusion of the war. He will be a free man. I will also recommend to my superiors that this location is unsuitable for an outpost, and that the army should withdraw." Clara's heart gave a single, painful thud. Freedom. For Jesse, for her land. It was everything she had fought for. She waited for the price. "In exchange," Emmeline finished, "you will sign the deed of transfer for your ranch. You will take the compensation and walk away. The land will be mine, personally. I will resign my commission and stay here. It is strategically valuable." The offer was as stunning as it was cruel. A trade. Jesse's life and freedom for her home. Emmeline was not offering a truce. She was offering a different kind of victory. She would get the land, and in the process, rid herself of the man who was a living reminder of her past. Clara looked at the woman on the cot, a woman who had tried to take everything from her, and now offered her a devil's bargain. She thought of Jesse, wasting away in that cell, giving up on life. She thought of her home, the legacy of her husband, the only thing in the world that was truly hers. She walked to the counter, took a piece of brown wrapping paper and a pencil stub. She wrote a few words, folded the paper, and walked back to Emmeline's cot. She placed it in her hand. "This is my answer," she said, and walked out without a backward glance. Emmeline unfolded the paper. In Clara's strong, clear script, it read, Asterisk, I keep my land. You can keep your man. Emmeline kept her word, or perhaps, more accurately, she cut her losses with the cold efficiency she had learned in the army. A dispatch rider arrived from the territorial capital the next morning with a sealed order. Jesse Callahan's charges were rescinded due to insufficient evidence and conflicting wartime records. He was unceremoniously shoved out of the stockade gate into the harsh light of midday. A free man who felt anything but... He did not know where to go. The world, which for days had been the size of a suffocating wooden box, was now a vast, empty expanse. He was a ghost in the town he had briefly inhabited. As he walked down the main street, a man without a horse, a bedroll, or a destination. The townsfolk stopped to stare. He saw a mixture of pity, suspicion, and fear in their eyes. He was the man who had faced down the army, the deserter, the widow's lover, the catalyst for all the trouble. He was a story they would tell for years, but he had no place in their lives. He drifted, aimless and hollow, from one end of the dusty street to the other, a man who had been granted a future he did not believe he deserved and had no idea how to begin. He was standing in front of the saloon, staring at his own grimy reflection in the window, when a wagon pulled up beside him. It was Clara. She sat on the driver's seat, her back straight, her hands holding the reins loosely. She didn't look at him with pity or anger or even love. Her expression was one of quiet, unshakable resolve. "Jesse," she said, her voice even. It was not a question or a command, but a simple statement of fact. He turned, his eyes, the eyes of a haunted animal, finally meeting hers. He said nothing. He had no words left. He had spent them all, along with his tears and his pride, on his knees in the dirt of her front yard. "Get in," she said. He obeyed, climbing onto the wagon bench beside her with the mechanical movements of an automaton. She slapped the reins, and the horses moved forward, pulling them away from the prying eyes of the town. The ride back to the ranch was conducted in a profound and absolute silence. The air between them was thick with the ghosts of Samuel, of the war, of his betrayal and her rage. Every bump in the road, every creak of the wagon wheels, every sigh of the wind seemed to scream the things they could not say. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, too ashamed to look at her. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, as if the force of her will alone could carve a path through the wreckage of their lives. When they reached the ranch, she led the horses to the barn, and he slid off the wagon. He stood in the yard, a stranger once more, waiting for his sentence. She unhitched the team with her usual competence, then walked to the house. The door opened. "Come inside," she said over her shoulder, and disappeared within. He followed her into the kitchen. The room was just as he remembered, clean and orderly, with Samuel's portrait still watching from the mantelpiece. She gestured to the chair at the table where he had sat for that first fateful meal. He sat, she sat opposite him, and then the silence resumed. It was a different silence now. It was not the comfortable quiet of their early evenings on the porch, nor the charged, anxious quiet of their dinner. This was a heavy, weighted silence, a vigil. They sat as the afternoon faded into a deep, velvety twilight. Clara lit a single kerosene lamp, and its warm, flickering glow pushed the shadows back, creating a small island of light in the vast darkness of the house and the world outside. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, a steady, inexorable sound marking the passage of moments, each one a grain of sand burying the past. He did not speak of the stockade. She did not speak of the petition or the storm or Emmeline. To speak of those things would be to give them power, to let them live in the air between them. Instead, they let the silence do the work. It was a crucible, burning away the anger, the pride, the fear, until all that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of their situation. Two profoundly damaged people, bound together by a shared trauma that had almost destroyed them. He had been her enemy, her betrayer. She had been his judge, his accuser, and now they were simply a man and a woman, sitting at a table in the middle of the night, with nowhere else on earth to go. Sometime after midnight, when the moon was high and the world outside was still, she reached across the table. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She did not startle him. He watched her hand, chapped and strong, as it moved through the lamplight. She did not take his hand. Instead, she laid her palm gently against the side of his face, her thumb stroking the rough stubble on his cheek. He flinched at the contact, but did not pull away. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping from beneath the lid and tracing a path through the grime on his face. Her touch was not one of passion or pity. It was a touch of profound, unadorned acceptance. She leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his, and she kissed him. It was a kiss unlike any they had shared. It was slow and soft, without hunger, without desperation. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and dust and sorrow. It was the taste of forgiveness. It was a promise not that the past could be erased, but that it could be survived. When she pulled back, the dam inside him finally broke. The silent, stoic shell he had inhabited since his release shattered, and the broken man within was laid bare. He began to weep, not with the loud, wrenching sobs of the man who had knelt on her porch, but with a silent, desperate grief, his shoulders shaking, his face contorted in a pain that was beyond words. She stood and pulled him to his feet. She led him, stumbling and blind, from the kitchen into the quiet darkness of her bedroom. What happened next was not an act of passion, but of communion. It was a ceremony of shared sorrow. Their clothes came off not with haste, but with a kind of reverence, unveiling scars both seen and unseen. They came together not in a frenzy of pent-up need, but in a slow, mournful embrace. It was an act steeped in tears, his of shame and gratitude, hers of grief and release. It was a desperate human clinging, a search for sanctuary in the flesh, a confirmation that they were both still alive, still capable of feeling something other than pain. When it was over, he did not pull away. He collapsed against her, burying his face in the hollow of her neck, and laid his head upon her chest. He clung to her with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He was no longer a soldier or a cowboy or a drifter. He was a child, lost and terrified, who had finally been allowed to come home. And she held him, stroking his hair, her own silent tears falling onto his back, holding him until the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the window. They awoke to a new world. The air in the room was still and quiet, cleansed by the night's catharsis. They did not speak of love, or of the future. They didn't need to. A decision had been made in the silent hours of the night. They were a fact now, a unit forged in betrayal and tempered by forgiveness. Later that morning, Clara rode into town. She went straight to the Reverend Michael's church. He met her at the door, his face a mixture of relief and awe. "I heard they let him go," he said. "They did," Clara confirmed. "And they will be back, or someone like them will. The army doesn't give up on something it wants." She held out the deed to her ranch. "I need you to do something for me, Reverend. I want to sign the land over to the church, in name only. You will hold it in trust. If the army comes back, they will have to contend with God's house, not a lone widow. Can you be brave enough to do that for me?" The Reverend, who had once counseled her to pray for softened hearts, looked at the determined woman before him, and then at the deed. He had seen her stand alone against soldiers. He had seen his town rally behind her. He found a strength he didn't know he possessed. "I can, Clara," he said, his voice firm. "I will." When she returned to the ranch, Jesse was waiting by the barn. He had found an axe, and he was methodically splitting logs for firewood. the rhythmic thud a steady, purposeful sound. Their eyes met across the yard. No words were needed. That afternoon, they began to rebuild. They started with the barn, replacing the timbers that had been weakened by years of neglect. They moved on to the northern fence line, the one he had first repaired, now walking it together, stretching the wire taut, digging new post holes side by side. The work was hard and relentless, their bodies aching by day's end, but it was good work. Every swing of the hammer was an act of defiance. Every newly set post was a declaration of permanence. They moved on to the fallow fields, the earth cracked and dry. Together, they hitched the old plow to the mule and took turns carving long, straight furrows into the stubborn soil. It was back-breaking labor, but as they worked, a change began to occur. They were no longer just mending a broken ranch. They were rebuilding a life. Each furrow was a line drawn against the past, and into the dark, turned earth. They began to sow the seeds of a future they had decided, against all odds, to claim as their own. The departure of the U.S. Army from Dry Creek was as quiet and inglorious as its arrival had been menacing. Emmeline left at the head of her platoon, her splinted leg propped uncomfortably in a modified stirrup. She did not look back. She rode with her face set like stone, her gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, on the world of politics and ambition she had come from and would now return to. She had come to the West to acquire a piece of land and had instead lost a piece of her soul. She left with nothing but the dust of Dry Creek on her uniform, the bitter taste of a moral defeat in her mouth, and the wound to her pride, which ached far more than her broken ankle. The town watched them go, not with cheers, but with a silent, collective sigh of relief. The blue-coated threat had receded, vanishing back into the vastness of the prairie from which it had emerged. In the days and weeks that followed, a slow but profound shift occurred in the town's perception of Jesse Callahan. He was no longer the whispered-about deserter or the widow's mysterious, ragged hired hand. He was the man who had knelt in the dirt and offered his life to stop the army. The people of Dry Creek, shrewd and pragmatic, understood that the fight on Clara's porch had been a fight for them all. The document Emmeline had carried was a weapon that could have been turned on any one of their homesteads, any one of their family claims. Jesse's act of defiance, born of his own shame and a desperate love, had become their shield. The change was not spoken aloud, but it was felt. When he and Clara rode into town for supplies, heads would nod in their direction. Mr. Abernathy would save the best cuts of bacon for them. The blacksmith, a man of few words, would simply look Jesse in the eye and give a short, sharp dip of his chin, a gesture of respect that meant more than any flowery speech. They saw him not as a Union man or a Confederate, but as one of them, a survivor who understood that in this harsh land, your home was the only kingdom you had, and it was worth dying for. He had saved them from the abstract tyranny of a distant government, and for that, his past was wiped clean from the slate of public opinion. Clara and Jesse settled into a life that was as quiet and steady as the turning of the seasons. It was a life measured not in grand events, but in small, meaningful rituals. They rose before the sun, shared a silent breakfast as the sky turned from gray to pink, and then went out to meet the day's labor. They worked side by side, a partnership of perfect, unspoken understanding. He was the brute strength that raised new barn walls. She was the careful planner who knew just when to plant and when to harvest. He learned the language of the land from her, the signs of rain in the clouds, the feel of healthy soil, the habits of the cattle. She, in turn, found a deep and abiding comfort in his presence, in the solid, dependable fact of him being there, a bulwark against the loneliness that had almost consumed her. They never married. The Reverend Michael, emboldened by his role as the land's protector, once delicately suggested it. Clara had simply smiled and shaken her head. A piece of paper from the state, a few words spoken before God. These things seemed small and unnecessary compared to the bond they shared. Their union had not been forged in a church. but in the crucible of betrayal, grief, and forgiveness. They were two souls who had been irrevocably torn by the war, and they had found a way to stitch themselves back together, not perfectly, but strongly. To put a conventional name to it felt like a betrayal of the unique, painful, and beautiful thing they had built from the ruins. They were more than husband and wife. They were fellow survivors who had found their own private peace at the end of the world. Years passed. The ranch thrived under their care. The fields produced corn and wheat. The herd grew fat and healthy, and the small house Samuel had built stood strong, a testament to endurance. Jesse's hair became streaked with gray, and the lines on Clara's face deepened. But they were lines of contentment now, not sorrow. The ghost of Samuel Whitmore did not vanish, but he ceased to be a source of pain. His portrait remained on the mantelpiece, and sometimes Clara would tell Jesse stories about him, of his love for books or his clumsy attempts at carpentry. Jesse would listen quietly, his guilt having long ago transmuted into a solemn respect for the man whose life was so inextricably woven with his own. He was no longer a specter of shame, but a quiet, foundational presence in the home they all shared. Then one autumn, when the cottonwood leaves were turning a brilliant, burning gold, Clara fell ill. It started as a cough, a weariness she dismissed as the product of a long season of hard work. But it deepened, settling in her chest, stealing her breath and her strength. The doctor from the next county came and went, shaking his head, speaking in low tones of lungs that had weakened over time. There was nothing to be done. Jesse became her constant, unwavering caretaker, just as he had been during that first storm so many years ago. He moved a cot into her room so he would never be more than a few feet away. He bathed her brow, read to her from Samuel's old books, and held her hand for hours, his calloused palm a familiar anchor in her sea of weakness. He saw the life slowly, gently ebbing from her, and he faced it with the same quiet stoicism with which he had faced everything. He had been given these years with her, a gift he never expected and felt he never deserved, and he would not dishonor them with rage or despair. He would simply be present, a loving witness to the end of her journey. One evening, the setting sun filled the room with a soft, coppery light. Clara's breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed. She stirred, her fingers tightening weakly around his.
"Jesse,"
she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. He leaned close. "I'm here. Clara, I'm right here." She opened her eyes, and for a moment they were clear and sharp, the stormy gray he had first seen on the porch. She looked at him, a faint, beautiful smile touching her lips.
"You know,"
she breathed, each word an effort. "I used to think your coming here was the beginning of my ruin." She paused, gathering her strength. "I was wrong." He could only watch her, his heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. "You didn't destroy me, Jesse," she whispered, her final words a gift, an absolution, a perfect summation of their impossible story. "You saved me." She closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her silver hair. Her hand went limp in his, and she was gone. Jesse stayed. The ranch was his vow, the land his testament. He kept it just as she had, the fences mended, the fields plowed, the cattle tended to. The townspeople watched him grow old, a quiet, solitary man who moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of the earth itself. He became a fixture, a living legend, the old man on the Whitmore place. He never took another partner, never sought another life. He had found his home, and he would be its faithful steward until the end. The story closes on a final, fiery sunset, the sky painted in the same bruised purples and blazing oranges of the evening she had first told him about Samuel. Jesse, now an old man with a back bent by years of labor and a face that is a roadmap of his life, sits on a simple wooden bench beside a small, weathered cross that bears a single name, Clara. The wind whispers through the tall prairie grass, a sound like a gentle sigh. He reaches into the pocket of his worn coat and pulls out a small, faded cotton handkerchief. He unfolds it carefully, his gnarled fingers tracing the small, simple C embroidered with blue thread. He lays his hand, the handkerchief still clutched within it, on the sun-warmed wood of the cross, and he watches the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, a faithful guardian waiting in the twilight. Thank you for listening to this tale from the heart of the Old West. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment down below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire for more stories like this one. And feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Jesse's journey.